open up to John chapter 11 here this evening. We're working our way through the 12 apostles. We went through the top tier apostles, the ones we know about the most and the ones who were the closest to Jesus. That's Peter, Andrew, James, and John, two sets of brothers. Now we're working our way through the second tier of disciples. We have Philip, the analytical apostle. We have Nathanael, or Bartholomew, a man who Jesus declared to be without hypocrisy. Last week we looked at Matthew, who also went by Levi, who was a tax collector in Capernaum, but walked away from a lucrative career to follow Christ. And this evening we're going to look at the last of the second tier disciples, the ones who we know the most about, before we get to the last tier. And then we know very, very little about the last tier, with one exception. That's Judas Iscariot. We know a little bit more about him. Tonight we're going to look at Thomas. Due in large part to a children's song, we think of Thomas as Doubting Thomas. But while we don't know a whole lot about Thomas, there's certainly more to him than his doubt. Thomas's name is found, as with Nathanael, it's found in the listings of the apostles, where it lists all of the 12. And the only place that we find any more information about him is in the Gospel of John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke just give us his name as one of the 12. But here we come to John and we find a little bit more information. Look at verse 16 of chapter 11, and we find out that he is a twin. It says, "Then said Thomas," which is called Didymus, and we'll stop right there and kind of break that down. Thomas means twin, and Didymus also means twin. You hear in Didymus, you hear ditto, almost. The same idea of, again, twofold or double. So he was a twin who was known as the twin. We have no information regarding the identity of Thomas' twin brother or sister. We don't know. We don't know where he was from. We don't know anything about them. So we'll just not conjecture. We know he's a twin. We don't know anything more than that regarding his family, but we know him to be, I'm calling him a loyal pessimist here. Look at the verse there in verse 16. We'll get there in just a few moments. The context here in John 11 is the story of Lazarus' death and subsequent raising by Jesus. Verses 1 to 3 tell us where he is. He's in Bethany. Bethany is just a little ways away. 15 furlongs is what the Bible says. It's a few miles from Jerusalem it would be to the east. And it tells us in verses 1 to 3 that he fell ill, and his sisters, Mary and Martha, sent to Jesus to inform him of their brother's condition. They went and told Jesus that the one whom you love is sick. Jesus, of course, was aware of Lazarus' condition before he got word. And he gives a comforting but somewhat cryptic response in verse 4. Look at it. It says, "When Jesus heard that, he said, 'This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God might be glorified thereby.'" Jesus declares his intention to journey to Bethany. He was in the wilderness by the Jordan, so he would be, we don't know exactly which side of the Jordan, but it's all wilderness down that side. He's down in the wilderness by Jordan when he gets this word. And so the disciples immediately, in verse 8, they question the wisdom of that. They say, "Lord, are you sure you want to go back?" Because remember, Bethany, very close to Jerusalem, and both of them are very firmly right in the heart of Judea. And Judea, of course, being where the religious leaders are centered. And the last time Jesus had been there, the Jews had tried to stone him to death. And so when Jesus announces his intention to go to Bethany, the disciples say, "Lord, that doesn't seem like such a great idea. Last time you were there, it didn't go well." But Jesus' sovereignty is on full display as he sets their concerns aside. And he says he is in fact going to go there. Verse 11, "These things said he, and after that he said unto them, Our friend Lazarus sleepeth, but I go that I may awake him out of sleep. Then said his disciples, Lord, if he's asleep, he shall do well. what does the doctor tell you when you're not feeling well? Go home and rest. Go sleep. And the disciples look at Jesus. They say, Lord, we heard that he's sick. If he's sleeping, why on earth would you go wake him up? That doesn't make any sense. Howbeit Jesus spake of his death in verse 13, but they thought that he had spoken of taking rest and sleep. Then said Jesus unto them plainly, Lazarus is dead. So no mincing of words. Now they get it very plainly. Lazarus is dead, and I'm glad for your sakes that I was not there, to the intent ye may believe. Nevertheless, let us go unto it. Now right here, in verse 11 down to verse 15, Jesus is setting the groundwork for one of the greatest miracles of his public ministry. There were others who Jesus raised from the dead. You remember the widow's son in Nain. He raised them, and Jesus certainly very likely raised others that we don't have listed. But this was a big deal. Jesus went, this was in front of a large crowd of people. This was a big deal. This was a very public miracle that he's going to announce. But we're not going to look at the miracle so much. We're going to look at what happened next. We label Thomas as a pessimist because of his response to Jesus. In verse 16, then said Thomas, which is called Didymus, unto his fellow disciples, let us also go, that we may die with him. That's pessimism right there. Okay? He's not talking about let us go that we can die with Lazarus. The idea is let us go and we'll die with Jesus. Because Jesus is going to go up here. The people in Judea, they're after him. They're going to kill him. They're going to kill us too. But let's go die together is the idea that he has here. This is pessimism, but I was reading one commentator, he labeled it as heroic pessimism. Lazarus is dead. The Jews are going to kill Jesus if he comes to Bethany. And Thomas is there to speak up and say, let's go, guys. We'll die with him. We'll die with Jesus. Thomas's leadership, though pessimistic, seems to have been effective, because in the very next verse, in verse 17, where do we find them? Well, we find them in Bethany. They're there. They've gone. And whatever you can say about Thomas' outlook, that's loyalty. That's extreme loyalty. To say, well, they're going to kill Jesus if he goes. Let's go. We're going to go, and we're all going to die together up here in Judea. And they go. They went all the way through. The dangers that lay ahead did not deter Thomas from following Christ. He was set. That's impressive to have that kind of dedication. As I was reading this, it made me think of, in the late 1800s, John Peyton, which if you're ever looking to read an interesting missionary biography, he wrote an autobiography that's tremendously fascinating. John Peyton felt God's call to go to the New Hebrides as a missionary. That would be called Vanuatu now, is what that is. And he was leaving the comforts of his home in Scotland to go on an especially difficult field, and it was known to be inhabited by cannibalistic natives. It was not a friendly place. It was difficult to get to. It was tropical. There was disease. But the cannibals were kind of the thing that everyone was most concerned about. And as he was preparing to go, he met with a group of men who desired to counsel him in his journey. They were trying to dissuade him, truth be told. And one elderly gentleman looked at Peyton and he declared, "You're going to be eaten by cannibals." That was kind of the end. He said much more, and he ends his diatribe with, "You're going to be eaten by cannibals." Peyton's answer is recorded for us. It reminded me of Thomas. Listen, this is what he said. He said, "Mr. Dixon, you're advanced in years now, and your own prospect is soon to be laid in the grave, there to be eaten by worms. I confess to you that if I can but live and die serving and honoring the Lord Jesus, it will make no difference to me whether I am eaten by cannibals or worms. And in the great day, my resurrection body will arise as fair as yours in the likeness of our risen Redeemer." You'd say, well, that's pessimistic. No, that's dedication. That's tremendous. Maybe we look at Thomas and we can give him a hard time, and we could even say he should have known better because obviously Jesus' death was on a time frame. It wasn't going to happen if it wasn't in God's will. But I choose to overlook his pessimism in favor of his loyalty, in favor of his dedication. Somebody said life's something that none of us get out of alive, and it's true. Mark 8:35 says, "For whosoever will save his life shall lose it. But whosoever shall lose his life for my sake and the gospel's, the same shall save it." Thomas' dedication to Jesus was not limited to comfortable situations. Thomas went with Jesus up around Galilee where it was theoretically safe. And Thomas was ready to go with Jesus, and he went with Jesus. You remember Peter kind of ran his mouth about being willing to go with Jesus anywhere. Thomas said, "Well, let's go. We're going to go up to Bethany and we're going to die." And he went. He followed through. That's dedication. So we'll say it's a loyal pessimist. He was not only a loyal pessimist, we see also a very devoted follower. You say you're repeating yourself. Well, flip to John 14, just a couple chapters here. John 14, very familiar set of verses here. In John 14, verse 1, Jesus is trying to comfort the disciples. He's already told them that he's going away. And he says, "Let not your hearts be troubled. Ye believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there ye may be also. And whither I go, ye know, and the way ye know." Thomas saith unto him, "Lord, we know not whither thou goest, and how can we know the way?" We just saw that Thomas was willing to follow Jesus into the very jaws of death, and he followed through with it. But here, Thomas hears Jesus speaking about leaving, and his first concern is that he doesn't know where Jesus is going, and that makes it impossible for him to follow. Lord, you just said that we know where you're going. We don't know where you're going. And if we don't know where you're going, then we can't follow you and get there. Even in this passage, you almost see his pessimism coming out a little bit. But Jesus' response to Thomas' question is one of the best known and most well-loved of his statements in John 14:6. Jesus saith unto him, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me." What was Thomas' greatest fear? I would make the case that given this and given what we just read, Thomas' greatest fear was losing Jesus. By losing, I don't mean he wanders off. His greatest fear was, one day I'm going to go to be with Jesus and he's not going to be there. In order to avoid that, I'll go die with him. But I don't want to lose Jesus. I want to be with him. I want to be near him. This is his level of devotion and his following. Which brings us to what he's most well known for. Because that we next read of him in chapter 20, where we find that he's the last one of them to stop doubting. I say he's the last one because they all doubted. We can give Thomas a hard time all we want, but really, Thomas was just the last one to quit. I don't know that I've ever given this story before, but maybe I have. When I was little, my dad was in ministry. My dad's a pastor, and my dad was sitting on the platform, and it was during the song service. It wasn't during the message. But during the song service, and there was a baby. Our church had been the old Sword of the Lord tabernacle, and it was a massive building. And there weren't that many of us in there, probably 100 maybe tops. But it was a very echoey building. And my brother and I were sitting there. My mom was playing the piano. My dad was on the platform, and a baby did something that caught me as a 4-year-old kind of funny. And my brother and I heard whatever happened with the baby somewhere in the auditorium, and we started laughing. So we're cutting up down in the audience, and we were sitting towards the back, and we started laughing. My brother and I were laughing. I'd like to make that very clear, that Wes and I were laughing. The problem is, Wes shut up and I didn't. I kept laughing too long. And my dad looked down and he saw me doing that. And my dad got up off of the platform and walked down the aisle and took me by the hand, and we went out around the church to the bathroom, and where I received an attitude adjustment. And then we came back into the church. Why did I get caught? Well, because I was the last one to stop. And so I got the punishment. I got the name for it. Thomas, it's the same thing. Thomas, they were all doing it. They were all doubting. And I could take you to many instances in the end of the Gospels. They were all doubting. None of them believed that Jesus had risen from the dead. But Thomas was the last one. Look with me here in John 20. It's the Sunday following the crucifixion. We know it as Resurrection Sunday. Jesus had appeared to Mary Magdalene that morning. In the evening, Jesus appears in the midst of the upper room where the disciples had gathered behind locked doors for fear of the Jews. We know earlier in the day Jesus had appeared to two of them as they walked on the way to Emmaus. Now he appears to all of them and shows himself to be literally and physically risen from the dead. He shows them the nail prints in his hand. He shows them the nail prints in his feet. Verse 24, but Thomas, one of the 12, called Didymus, was not with them when Jesus came. We don't know why. It doesn't say. We don't have any of the backstory of that. But again, given what we know of Thomas, given the fact that Thomas's greatest fear is losing Jesus, maybe he took it harder. Maybe this wiped Thomas out when he lost Jesus. I would imagine all of the disciples spent a very dark 3 days and 3 nights. But perhaps no one more than Thomas. And perhaps he was by himself in the pit of despair. And he wasn't there in the upper room. He wasn't together with the other 10 who were left. Verse 25, the other disciples therefore said unto him, now they're all together, and the disciples, 10 of them, remember Judas is gone, they said unto him, we have seen the Lord. But he said unto them, Thomas said unto them, except I shall see in his hands the prints of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and thrust my hand into his side, I will not believe. I think if you were to accuse him of being a pessimist right here, I think he'd say, look, I'm not being a pessimist. I'm being, what do pessimists like to call themselves? I'm being a realist, right? I'm not being a pessimist, I'm being a realist. Look, I too wish that Jesus were alive. But you and I, we all know that the Romans are good at crucifixion. He's dead, and we're just going to have to deal with that, guys. I don't know what you think you saw, but you didn't see Jesus. We know that Jesus is dead. Thomas is not willing to accept what the others had seen and felt. Verse 26, and after 8 days, remember, all of the other disciples, the 10, they've all seen Jesus. They've all talked to him. They've all touched him. They know that Jesus is alive. But 8 days pass in which Thomas lives in denial. Thomas says, I don't know what you guys think you saw, but I know Jesus is dead. You didn't see Jesus. You couldn't have seen Jesus. I don't even know what happened to his body, but he's dead. He's gone, guys, and I'm not going to believe. I won't set myself up for heartache, for heartbreak again. For a whole week he persisted in his unbelief, but 8 days later, when the disciples were within, verse 26, and Thomas with them, then came Jesus, the doors being shut, and stood in the midst and said, peace be unto you. Interesting that, again, they come. Jesus comes into the midst, and again they're startled. Why? Well, because the doors were locked, and suddenly somebody who hadn't been there before was there. Verse 27. Jesus immediately addresses not all of them. He addresses Thomas. Then saith he to Thomas, Reach hither thy finger, and behold my hands. Reach hither thy hand, and thrust it into my side, and be not faithless, but believing. Interesting. If we were to go back, and we won't for sake of time tonight, but if we were to go back and look at when Jesus appeared to the 10 who were in the upper room, when he came, he rebuked them for their unbelief. He kind of scolded them for it. He doesn't scold Thomas. Rather, he gently and kindly turns his attention to the one naysayer in the room. And Jesus knew the conditions that Thomas had set. If you look back in verse 25, Thomas said, Except I see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and thrust my hand into his side, I will not believe. And Jesus, in verse 27, he says, Here they are, reach out. Here's my side, reach out. He sees the scars. He knows what Thomas had asked for. Jesus reached out to Thomas with nail-scarred hands and commands him. It's kind of interesting. He commands him, be not faithless. That's the Greek word apistos. The Greek word for faith is pistos. Apistos, or no faith. Be not without faith, but be believing. It's the word pistos. So don't be without faith, rather be full of faith. Verse 28, And Thomas answered and said unto him, My Lord and my God. Did Thomas reach out and touch? We don't know. We don't have it recorded for us that Thomas actually reached out and put his finger in the nail prints. We don't know if he actually did it, but we do know that right here, from this point on, Thomas now has a rock-solid belief in the resurrected Christ. A devoted man whose greatest fear was being without Christ is reunited with Christ. That would have been a special time for Thomas. Verse 29, Jesus saith unto him, Thomas, because thou hast seen me, thou hast believed. Blessed are they that have not seen, and yet have believed. That's talking about us, that verse right there. It's talking about me. I have never seen, but I believe. What would it have taken to convince Thomas that Jesus had not risen from the dead at this point? Absolutely nothing. Nothing would convince Thomas of this. The last biblical record that we have of Thomas is there in the upper room. We just read it. Verse 29. Reliable church history tells us that Thomas lived out the rest of his days, sharing the gospel of his risen Lord. Traditional history tells us that Thomas went as far as India. Now, when I was thinking about that, I was looking at India. It's a long way, but we're not talking about like Western India. He made it all the way down to southern India, all the way down into the bottom of India, on the western or on the eastern side of India, over 3,000 miles from Jerusalem. If you were to drive it by car, which he certainly did not, it would have been a long and arduous journey to get there. There's a hill today outside of the Madras airport where a marker is set up marking what they believe to be the grave of Thomas, still in India. It's believed that he was speared to death by the unbelievers trying to silence him. Interesting that a man who said that his faith could be confirmed by touching where the spear had pierced Christ ended his life on the end of the spear. But there are churches today in India that can trace their origins back to the time when Thomas would have been in India. So a man who had doubts, who was a bit of a pessimist, but who was undyingly loyal and supremely devoted and loved Jesus so much that he was willing to go and spend his life in spreading the good news of his Lord. You know, some people tend towards pessimism. And if we're completely honest, reality is a bit bleak most of the time. Not sometimes, most of the time. We look around us, we watch the news, or we see what's going on and things are bleak. It would be easy to be pessimistic. We need to be careful in these times to be sure that we're like Thomas. If you are going to be pessimistic, keep your eyes fixed on Christ. Be fiercely loyal, regardless of the consequences. You and I can maintain this same type of loyalty to Christ, and we should. Be devoted followers. Be a dedicated witness for Christ. That's what Thomas was. We call him Doubting Thomas just because, again, because he was the last one to quit, not because he was the only one. They all doubted. But Thomas certainly came out of his doubt. And perhaps, as you read this, I get the idea that Thomas loved Jesus an awful lot. To say, Jesus is going to Bethany, they're going to kill him there, I'm going to. They'll kill me too. That's fine, but I'm going to be with Jesus. Thomas loved his Lord, and he was willing to expend any effort for the cause of Christ. We haven't been called to go and die for Christ. Could happen, but it hasn't yet. We're called to live for him. We're called to witness for him in a land that's still very blessed with freedom. We should do so. We should take advantage of the freedoms that we have and of the opportunities that we have.